We have visited Scotland on many occasions in the past, and this time we flew in from Ireland to Glasgow, and then we drove across to Edinburgh to spend a few days there before we end up driving up to Inverness. And after a few days there, we drove back down to Glasgow to drop off the family on their way home, then up to Arrochar, and then we drove round to the Mull of Kintyre and Campbeltown. Finally, we drove back round to Largs and in to Glasgow. As soon as we picked up our car, we drove across to Edinburgh, as we were attending a tattoo that evening. After a day meeting up with family, we headed for a tour of Edinburgh Castle. And it's quite steep going up the hill. The old barracks that now hold a cafe are well worth a visit. Now, the Great Hall is well worth a visit. Although some of the accommodation wasn't that great. The good thing about the castle, there are so many buildings and different displays to explore. There are good views over the city and down to Leith and the harbour area from the castle. Now this gun is fired at 1 p.m. each day to allow the ships in the harbour to set their clocks. In the afternoon we left the castle and walked down the Royal Mile to join a tour of the vaults in South Bridge. Now South Bridge was completed in 1788 and the vaults were used to house taverns and workshops, later used by the homeless and for some criminal activity like gambling and taverns, illegal whiskey distillery, and according to rumour, body snatchers stored corpses there overnight. We had to walk down alleyways and then under the Cowgate Bridge to get to the vaults. There were displays of tools and torture items. And of course these vaults also served as slum housing at one stage. Many rooms housed 10 people. And there was crime and robbery and murder. These days, the Witches' Coven and Stone Circle are set up for the tourists.
Environment. Now, traditionally, stone circles act like safe spaces, to keep spirits out. What plenty of horror films, you know what I'm talking about. But this stone circle here, according to George Cameron from the mid-90s onwards, it's the opposite. Keep spirits in, keep people like us out.
Next day, we headed north over the Forth Road Bridge and up the A9 to Inverness, and our first stop was to be the Culloden Battlefield. The display centre shows the build-up to the battle, with the government plans on the left and the Jacobites on the right. Outside the battlefield is displayed, and there is a cairn showing the location of each clan on the government side. And large stones show where the Jacobite clans fell. Judging by the flowers at the foot of the stones, feelings still run high, and a Jacobite memorial was erected there in 1871. We walked around to the Jacobite side of the battlefield, and the wall that the government forces breached after they outflanked the Jacobites has been rebuilt in its original position. Next day we were on a bus tour to the Isle of Skye. Starting from Inverness, it headed down the western side of Loch Ness before turning west and crossing the bridge to Skye, and then up to Portree and Staffin on the northeast corner of the island. First stop was Arrochar Castle, and this castle saw military action from the 1200s till its demise in 1692. Part of the tower crashed to the ground in 1715 after a violent storm. And from there were also nice views of Loch Ness. Then it was across the country to the west. Our next stop was the most photographed castle, Dun. After crossing onto Skye, we next stopped at Campbeltown, a really beautiful spot. There are 3 beautiful mountains surrounding this area. Next stop was Portree for lunch. Now the bus dropped us off in the main street and we meandered down to the harbour. Now it was very busy, but we managed to get some lunch and then we headed up to the hill behind the town to sit down, relax and enjoy lunch. Then we were off to Staffin on the northeast corner of the island to view the Melt Falls and Kilt Rock. There are some beautiful views from this point. And of course we can't ignore the store and the interesting rock pinnacle, the Old Man store. Next day it was another bus trip from Inverness, this time heading down the eastern side of Loch Ness to Fort Augustus, then on to Fort William, and then heading west to Mallaig to get the Jacobite Express train back to Fort William. We stopped at Dores Beach on Loch Ness, plenty of good pebbles for skimming. Next stop was Fort Augustus, where the highway crosses over the Caledonian Canal at the Swing Bridge. On the other side of the bridge are the locks take the canal up. And a short distance away is the river that feeds the canal. Glenfinnan is where the railway viaduct seen in the Harry Potter films is located. And they also have another monument there to those who died in the Jacobite cause. At Mallaig we joined the Jacobite Express. Now this train runs between Mallaig and Fort William, and it works its way through some wonderful Scottish countryside. We arrive at the Glenfinnan Viaduct. I'm sure the Harry Potter fans will enjoy this. Then it was on to Fort William. On our way back to Inverness, we stopped at Spain Bridge to look at the Commandos Memorial. This area was their training ground back in the Second World War. Next morning, we visited Falls Castle, the seat of the Munros. Now the castle had been remodelled into a Georgian mansion, but we did have another nice guided tour. We visited here in 2012, and Mrs. Munro in those days was very proud of the work she'd done to restore the original kitchen back to a display standard. And of course the courtyard is always nice. And this time we were actually able to go into one of the old towers of the castle. It had really good thick walls. The rest of the family were flying out from Glasgow later in the day, so it was a long drive down to Glasgow. Unfortunately, we had to stop at Stirling. Then we picked up another Arrochar and drove it up to Arrochar at the head of Loch Long for the night. The next morning, we drove down to the Mull of Kintyre and the town of Campbeltown. And what a nice little town it is. And it also had a very well sheltered harbour. The rest of the day we rested. The next morning we drove from Campbeltown down to Southend, and then onto the lighthouse along a very narrow road. The public road ended before the road steeply descended down to the lighthouse. but at least we could see down to the lighthouse. On the way back we got great views of the south end. In the afternoon we had booked into a distillery tour. Now Stringbank does each and every step of the distilling process on site, starting with its traditional floor malting. The grain is then dried using a peat-fired kiln. And it's then stored in these bins for a couple of months. The grain is then milled into grist using a very reliable 80-year-old machine. And then it is added to hot water in the mashing stage, and the wort is transferred to these wooden wash bags. Here the yeast is added, converting the sugars into alcohol. It is distilled 2.5 times before being transferred into the casks. The filled casks are then transported to the dark, moist warehouse and left for a minimum of 3 years. The whisky is matured for various times, depending on what you're going to do, up to 50 years for some. The next day, as there were no ferries available, we had to drive back around to Glasgow and on to Largs. It was very busy on the Saturday, but Sunday morning was nice and quiet. And then after another couple of days with family, we started a journey back to Australia. Soon, we were settled in for the 13-hour flight to KL in Malaysia. After several hours sleep, we awoke to a very short day and found we're heading soon into KL. And then, after a few more hours sitting around, we departed for Sydney and arrived home after 43 hours travelling.